Hopkins, who is the vice president of our association and the chief economist of the Colorado Legislative Council, will moderate this event, and I'll soon ask her to introduce her colleagues. But before I do that, I'd like to make you aware of our next event, specifically in 2 weeks, on the 20th of October. Dr. Jason Fields is going to present to a DABE audience on the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey. The data for that was collected last year, and the survey occurs about every 9 years, I believe. In November, we're working on something in the area of sports betting. We'll keep you posted as that comes together. Without further stalling on my part, I'm going to give you Kate. She's going to introduce the speakers and topic. The speakers will present for about 30 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A, and we'll seek to get you out of here by 1. Thank you again for joining us. Kate.
Thanks so much, Tim, and great to be here with all of you. We're very lucky today to have 2 of the authors of the Blue Book Voter Guide. That's the ballot information booklet that comes to every household in the state of Colorado. These 2 authors, Anna Gerstle and Matt Bishop, are with us today to talk about the 3 statewide ballot measures that are on the ballot this November. They are from Legislative Council staff, which is the nonpartisan research staff of Colorado State Legislature. Anna is a senior fiscal analyst with Legislative Council staff, primarily focusing on K-12 education, school finance, higher ed, and some business and personal property tax related topics. She holds degrees from the University of Oregon and the University of Colorado at Denver. Matt Bishop is a fiscal analyst with Leg Council staff, primarily focusing on capital construction, tax policy, and climate policy. And he has a Master of Public Policy from the University of Michigan. Please do feel free to submit questions in the chat. I'm going to send a message to all of you right now. Feel free to respond to that as questions come up, and we'll be sure to get those out there and to our presenters. With that, turning it over to Matt and Anna. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Tim, for the introductions today. Thanks everyone also for inviting us to talk to you about the work that we've been doing with the Blue Book. Hopefully, at least some of you have started to receive your Blue Books in the mail with our analyses of this year's ballot measures. Before we get to the measures themselves, I'm just going to start with a little overview of what our process is like. Our writing teams start work on the Blue Book in May or June of each year with the goal of getting everything wrapped up by the end of August or early September. Our schedule is really dictated by the date of the election. We're working back from that, trying to make sure that everything is exactly the way we want it and approved so that it can get in the Blue Book and get in the mail so that you have plenty of time to dig into these measures before the election comes up. Our writing teams conduct interviews with proponents and opponents of the measure and other interested parties as well as part of our background research to try to understand as much as we can about what the measure does, what the intentions are behind the measure, and to try to anticipate what downstream consequences might occur. Our writing teams prepare 2 to 3 drafts, each of which is released for public comment. This year, because the legislative session was delayed a little bit, but the election has not been delayed, we've created 2 drafts of each measure that went out for public comment this year. We use those comments in conjunction with our in-house review teams to iterate on our work to try to get these analyses in the best shape they can for the voters. Anyone is allowed to sign up to receive copies of our drafts and to submit public comments to us. Of course, we're no longer taking comments because the Blue Book is published, but definitely keep this in mind for future years if you'd like to be a part of this process at all. And then finally, the Blue Book analyses are approved by the Legislative Council, which is a committee of legislators who receive our final drafts. We present them to them, and the legislators are allowed to make any amendments to them with a 2/3 vote, and then they finally approve the version that shows up in the Blue Book itself. This year, that took place the first week of September, and like I said, hopefully some of you have even gotten to take a look at your Blue Books already. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into Amendment 78. I was the lead writer for this for this amendment, and we titled our analysis "Legislative Authority for Spending State Money." So this measure is a bit of inside baseball in terms of the legislative process. So we'll dive right into what the measure does. So first off, it prohibits state agencies from spending custodial money without appropriation by the state legislature. This is a formal budgeting procedure that the state goes through every year. I'll note that we did try to avoid using the word appropriation in our Blue Book write-up, although I'm going to use it a little more loosely here with this audience. Definitely ask any questions you have about that or anything else as we go along, and Kate will collect them. The measure also requires custodial money to be deposited in a newly created cash fund, which is called the Custodial Funds Transparency Fund. And it requires interest earned on the fund to be transferred to the state's general fund, where it can be spent on any purpose. And then finally, it requires the state legislature to appropriate money from the new cash fund every year following a public hearing. So this is opposed to current practice in which most custodial funds may be spent without formal legislative approval, since the money originates outside of state government and the purpose for which it may be spent is already determined. So this will lead to a couple of changes should Amendment 78 pass this fall. If I could describe what the measure does in one sentence, this would be it. Amendment 78 says that all state spending would require an appropriation. Another change is that the legislature may make some different decisions about spending these kinds of money than state agencies would have. Though please note that any purpose that's been specified for custodial funds does not change. So for example, if there were a federal grant for multimodal transportation that the state were to implement, the state legislature might choose different methods or different ways that money is implemented, but the multimodal transportation grant would still have to be used for that purpose. And then finally, a new spending process may be required to authorize expenditures that occur outside of the legislative session. As you may be aware, Colorado has a part-time legislature that meets typically in the first 4 months of the year, and that is a time when all the bills are passed. So if custodial funds or other funds that would be sort of collected under the umbrella of Amendment 78 were received outside of the legislative session, there would need to be a process by which that spending could be authorized. So I have a list here of some examples of money that would be affected. We've talked a lot about custodial funds, and the amendment defines custodial funds, though it applies to all state spending somewhat more broadly. So here are some of examples of money that would be affected by Amendment 78 that currently don't require this annual appropriation. One of the big examples would be emergency relief funds, such as CARES Act funding. This is a case where billions of dollars were received by the state from the federal government, and those spending decisions for that money was made by the governor's office and by state agencies. So under Amendment 78, instead, that money would go into this new cash fund and be appropriated by the state legislature. This also applies to other kinds of federal funding, including federal grants, which I'll mention again soon. Legal settlements, these are cases where court orders specify how the state is to spend money received in a legal settlement, and in current practice, that money is spent under the authority of the district attorney or the state attorney general's office. And under the Amendment 78, the legislature would have a hand in that as well. Transportation funding is another example. Currently, transportation funding is spent by Colorado's Independent Transportation Commission, whereas under the amendment, again, this would qualify as custodial funds and require an appropriation. Grants, again, including grants received from the federal government or grants received from private foundations or other private organizations or businesses. And then gifts and donations received by the state, which includes gifts or donations made to state colleges and universities. I'll talk very briefly about some of the other impacts of the measure. Currently, interest on custodial money would remain available for the same purpose as the custodial money. Would generate in whatever state cash fund the custodial money is sitting in. Amendment 78, because the money is placed in this custodial funds transparency fund, some of that interest will accrue to that fund, and the measure directs all of the interest on the fund to the general fund where it can be used for any purpose. The other revenue impact here is that custodial money and interest earned on it are exempt from the state's revenue limit. This is not a big change because most custodial funds are already exempt from the state's revenue limit. I mention this only for those of you who may be aware that money that's moved to the general fund, such as this interest, would typically then be subject to the state's revenue limit. The amendment specifically exempts that, and in this way, the measure is kind of neutral with regards to the state's revenue limit. I have a few comments on the measure's fiscal impact. We've estimated that state expenditures will increase by about $1 million. This would be for additional budget staff in both state agencies and with the state legislature. Because these custodial funds and other funds impacted by the amendment would be subject to these new requirements, we're anticipating, especially in the early years, just a lot of additional accounting work that'll be done to make sure that we're in full compliance. It's possible, of course, that some state agency spending could be affected, again, if the legislature makes different decisions than state agencies would have about spending custodial money. And then finally, just a note here on state revenue. There's potentially an impact to state revenue from the measure, but this depends on how the measure will be implemented. And that line will be probably my answer to most questions about Amendment 78. It depends on how the measure will be implemented. Because these custodial funds would typically go into a cash fund controlled by state agencies, but instead is put into this new custodial funds transparency fund. The interest then would be directed to the general fund. So that could impact basically how interest revenue is earned, both in the amount, if these accounts have different interest rates, and the things that those funds are used for. I'll kind of leave it there because, again, we don't know how long money could sit in this fund or be redirected to another fund, and that will depend on how the legislature would choose to implement Amendment 78 should it pass. And I'm going to end my portion of our discussion on Amendment 78 with an overview of our arguments. We've created one argument in support of Amendment 78 and one argument in opposition. What I have here is kind of paraphrased from what we have in the Blue Book, so see that for more details. But our argument in support of Amendment 78 is that it increases transparency and accountability in state government by requiring a clear public record and a public hearing before funds are spent. And then our argument against Amendment 78 is that it adds unnecessary bureaucracy and risks unintended consequences, and that a longer approval process could delay or interrupt state services or possibly jeopardize grant awards received by the state. So please, again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat for Kate. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Anna.
Great, thanks, Matt. I will be talking about the two other statewide ballot measures that are on the ballot this November. The first one being Proposition 119, which is the Learning Enrichment and Academic Progress Program, which I think you might hear it referred to as the LEAP program as you start hearing more about these. So what the measure would do is it would create a program to provide financial aid for out-of-school learning opportunities for kids. It would do it through an independent state agency that would administer the program. And in terms of what the money is used for, it is used for out-of-school learning opportunities. And the measure defines those as really any program, service, activity that would provide educational or developmental support outside of the regular school day. I think the examples you'll hear a lot about are tutoring, second language learning, career and technical education, those types of things, and things that are outside of your regular school day. And Matt, if you can go on to the next slide, that would be awesome. So in terms of how the program works, the measure would create a new authority to administer the program. It would be sort of in conjunction with the Department of Education, but it would have a separate board and separate administration. The board would be appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. And the measure leaves a lot of sort of the logistical details up to the authority to decide how to do it. But there are a few kind of fundamental components that are specified. The first being that parents would pick a provider from a list of approved providers. School districts are automatically eligible as a provider, and there is a kind of a priority process for teachers to be approved for these funds. So if you're a parent, you feel your child could use additional tutoring, and you can select from the list of approved providers, and the authority would direct funds for tutoring to that provider for your child. The measure provides this funding, these services for all students, but establishes some priority for low-income students, especially in the first couple of years. The first, in 2023, it lays out the three sort of prioritization levels you see on the screen there. First, for families with income at or below the federal poverty limit, and then for families with income up to twice the limit, and then finally for all other participating students. In out years, the program would still prioritize low-income students, and the authority would have the discretion to determine the amount of aid per student, the timing, and the kind of the distribution process. Next slide. So in terms of how this program would be funded, the primary mechanism is through an increase in the state's marijuana sales tax. It would be, it's ultimately a 5% increase by 2024, and that increase is phased in over the first few years of the program. So you can see in that graph there that the rate is currently 15%, and it'll increase slowly over 2022 to 2024. And our office's estimates are that it would generate about 138 million in fiscal year 24-25 once it's fully phased in. Next. So the other funding mechanism associated with this program would be transfers of existing state funds. So the measure would transfer approximately $22 million a year from the general fund for this program, and then would transfer the same amount, approximately 22 million, from the permanent fund to the state public school fund. The permanent fund contains state land board revenue, a lot of primarily lease revenue, and it's invested, and then the proceeds from that investment are used to fund school finance. So it's a small change in how the money ends up in the state public school fund for school finance. But I think in terms of funding this program, $22 million from the general fund is kind of the second component. So the Blue Book includes 2 arguments for and 2 arguments against the measure. And as Matt said, this is sort of a brief, slightly shorter version of the argument. So take a look at the Blue Book for the full explanation. But the first argument for this measure is that it provides needed funding for tutoring and other out-of-school learning services to help students who are struggling academically. It's, with COVID-19 and now a few school years impacted by it, there's a greater need for these types of services. The second argument for is that while it supports the needs of all students, it especially supports the needs of low-income students, while also providing parents the flexibility to select the services that their children need the most. And then the 2 arguments against this measure. The first is that it allows public money to be directed to private out-of-school service providers instead of investing it directly in public schools. I'll note, and I should have mentioned this earlier, the money can be used for a private tutoring provider or private, other private services, but it cannot be used to pay for private school. Everything funded by these have to be outside of the typical school day. And the second argument against is that increasing sales tax on marijuana will hurt legitimate marijuana businesses and could start pushing people into the black market. So with that, I will move on to the third and final of the statewide ballot measures this year. This is Proposition 120, property tax assessment rate reduction. And as that sounds, it would reduce property tax assessment rates for certain types of properties. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background information in terms of how property taxes are calculated. Property taxes are paid on a portion of a property's actual market value. So in 2021, if you own a house, you pay taxes on 7.15% of your property's value. That assessment rate is the piece of this formula that is impacted by Proposition 120. The local tax rates are then applied to that taxable portion of your property value. And mill levies are set locally. They're set by school districts, cities, counties, special districts. But it's really this assessment rate portion that is impacted by this measure. So what does this measure do? A yes vote on this ballot measure would reduce assessment rates for multifamily housing and lodging properties. Beginning in 2022, it would set the assessment rate at 6.5% for multifamily properties and 26.4% for lodging properties. Lodging properties includes hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, that type of thing. It does not include short-term rental properties. And then multifamily housing includes any apartment building with at least one housing unit, or more than one housing unit, I should say. Duplexes, triplexes, that type of thing. Although I'll note that it would exclude condos. So you're mostly talking about a lot of apartment buildings. The measure also would allow the state to retain $25 million above the constitutional spending limits if it is spent on the senior and disabled veteran homestead exemptions. And we could talk more about that if you have questions, but it's really kind of a state accounting, state spending limit function, and the measure does not change the availability of the homestead exemption or state reimbursements to local governments for that purpose. A no vote on the measure is kind of the flip side of what I've talked about. It would maintain the assessment rates that are established in current law, which is 29% for lodging properties and 6.8% for multifamily in 22 and 23, and 7.15% in 2024. Next. So this is where this measure gets a little bit confusing. When you get your ballot, you take it out, you read the ballot question, it will differ from the explanation that I just gave you. As you can see on this slide, there on the right is the ballot question. And as you'll notice, Proposition 120 was initially written to lower the assessment rates for all residential and most non-residential property. The ballot question was set back in April or May. However, the impact of this measure has changed due to a law that was passed by the legislature after the ballot question was already set. Next. So to talk a little bit more about the bill that was passed, the legislature passed Senate Bill 21-293 in June, and it established new categories of properties. And you can see some of the changes in this table, but the way that the bill was crafted, the result is that the lower assessment rates that are set in Proposition 120 only apply to multifamily housing in the case of residential and lodging properties in the case of non-residential. So the section of statute that is amended by the measure was amended again after the fact by the legislature. And so the lower residential assessment rate of 6.5% only applies to multifamily, 26.4% only applies to lodging properties. As you can see in this slide, the bill also temporarily reduced the assessment rates for other subclasses of property, specifically for residential, single family homes, other residential properties, agricultural land, and renewable energy properties. And those changes in the bill are temporary changes. So it's something the legislature will go back to theoretically in a couple of years. But the impact of the measure is ultimately on multifamily housing and lodging properties. So what happens if this measure passes? It would reduce property taxes for multifamily and lodging property owners compared to what they would have paid otherwise. This doesn't necessarily mean that those property owners would see a decrease in their property tax bill, as property values in most areas of the state are growing, but it would either reduce the increase in property taxes, and in some cases could be a small decline. The flip side of that is that it will also reduce revenue to most local governments compared to what they would have collected otherwise. The actual impact on local governments will vary a lot around the state, particularly depending on the mix of properties. If a local jurisdiction has very little multifamily or lodging properties, they will not see a significant impact. But other areas that have a lot of those property types will see a more significant impact. Changes in property values in an area will also impact whether a local government will see an impact. And finally, local governments will also be impacted by their current mill levy policies. Some local governments have adopted local ballot questions to allow a mill levy to fluctuate to address changes in an assessment rate, but whether those apply and if this measure were to pass really depends on the wording of their ballot questions. To look at the fiscal impact a little bit, we've estimated that statewide, the local property tax reduction would be about $45.9 million in 2022 and about $50 million in 2023. And I will just note, going back to the ballot question, the ballot question states that there's a $1.03 billion decrease in local property tax revenue. That is an estimate that was calculated prior to the passage of Senate Bill 293. And so the other impact that I wanted to just touch briefly on was the impact on school finance in the state. The measure doesn't necessarily change the levels of funding that schools receive through the School Finance Act. But the way the system works right now, the state backfills the difference between local property tax revenue and an amount identified for each school district through the school finance formula. So a reduction in local property tax increases the share that the state must pay. We've estimated that the state backfill to school districts would increase by $12.8 million in fiscal year 22-23 and $14 million in 23-24. That doesn't necessarily change the amount that the school finance formula would identify for school districts, but would shift sort of the balance between local property tax revenue and the state share. And finally, many school districts have other property taxes that are separate from the school finance system. The state does not backfill those, and those may be impacted by the measure, but it really depends on how the question was written, property values in that district, and some local factors. And so to just touch on an argument for and argument against the measure, the first argument for in the Blue Book is that it provides tax relief to important sectors of Colorado's economy. May incentivize, housing development or provide lodging properties, the ability to maybe hire staff, reduce rent, rates, that type of thing. And the argument against the measure is that reducing property tax revenue to local governments may result in cuts to important services such as fire protection, water, transportation, education, and primarily for areas that rely on property tax revenue from lodging and multifamily housing properties. I think that will wrap up the part of the presentation that we've prepared, but we're happy to take any questions you have.
Thanks so much, Anna and Matt. A number of questions came in, and I'm going to start with the custodial funds, the first measure that was addressed, because that's where the most questions have come in so far. Grouping a couple of these different questions, Matt, could you speak a little bit about what this might mean with federal emergency funds, and then also on the federal funds side of things, what this might mean for the federal match for Medicaid?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. We're not anticipating any sizable impact to Medicaid or federal reimbursements for Medicaid. Those are funds that kind of come in and out of state funds really quickly. And while I want to be clear that there's some uncertainty for different kinds of funds. We talked with the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, and we're not expecting any major changes with how Medicaid would be implemented.
How much money are we really talking when we're talking about custodial funds and any other funds where this would change the budgeting process? About how much, like kind of what share of the total state budget, or how much are we talking?
That's another great question, and I don't have a great answer for that. There are some cases where money that would be qualified as custodial under the amendment's definition might already even be in the long bill. Transportation funding is an example where that money has a line in the long bill, which is the state's annual budget bill, but with an informational note. It's not formally appropriated and could be appropriated. However, when there are cases, especially when state agencies receive grants outside of the legislative cycle, we don't have a good estimate for what the sort of total amount of that is. And then finally, for more, those are maybe some of the more regular occurrences, like transportation funding. It's something that happens every single year. For things like emergency relief funds, those of course can vary a lot year to year. CARES Act, again, was billions of dollars. It was quite a big deal. I don't think we're all expecting billions and billions of dollars every year. But the bottom line is I don't have a good estimate for an order of magnitude for everything that will constitute custodial funds or be otherwise impacted by the measure compared to the size of the state budget.
And two other questions that I'm going to group together. Can you speak a little bit about maybe, and perhaps this gets into too partisan a territory, but the kind of proponents or the people in support of this measure and kind of what the motivation might be? So for example, is there evidence of misuse of funds or something else that might have motivated this particular measure to be on the ballot?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that. We have not come into any awareness of any, for example, misuse of funds. Our understanding from discussing with the proponents and from comments that they've made in the review and comment hearing and the title board hearing prior to our work on the Blue Book is really desire for more transparency, which I think was motivated by the CARES Act funding and all this federal stimulus money that's become available and has been kind of spent more or less unilaterally by the executive branch, by the governor's office and state agencies, and their desire for some more public scrutiny, which would occur for any money spent by the legislature, which every bill the legislature passes gets a public hearing and an opportunity for public comment.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. Anna, some questions for you on Proposition 119. How do marijuana taxes compare relative to the tax rate how does that compare relative to other illicit or kind of other sin taxes, so to speak? So liquor, any cigarettes. Can you speak to that? And I imagine the tax rates are a little bit different based on how they're assessed. But can you give us kind of a feel for the relative taxation of marijuana versus other substances?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I mean, I don't know the specific rates of different sin taxes, but marijuana, I believe marijuana is taxed at a higher rate than other sin taxes. And I will note that the graph that I showed on the slide, 15% current sales tax rate, and then that increasing. That's just the sales tax rate. There are excise taxes in addition that are paid on it. So the sliver in that graph doesn't quite capture it all. I mean, marijuana taxes are significantly higher than the taxes on liquor products, and taxes on cigarette and tobacco products. If you remember, Proposition EE was on the ballot in 2020 and passed, which increased those taxes and expanded some of them to nicotine products. I believe those rates are still lower than the marijuana rates, but they have increased in recent years as part of that measure to fund some specific health and educational related programs. But I would say that these are marijuana is a little bit, and maybe it's in its own category a little bit.
Sure, thanks so much for that. And kind of building off of that, could you speak a little bit about the research that you might have come across when it comes to shifting consumption to the black market? Getting to one of the arguments against the measure, it seems like that might be something relevant. And with this crowd, we're always interested in just economies, how they might shift. And so we'd be curious, any thoughts or research that you came across on that front?
Yeah, so there have been studies done that our team referenced in putting this together and putting that argument against the measure into the Blue Book. As I understand it, there's discussion about what the tipping point is. At what point does a tax rate drive people to the black market? I don't know that there's been specific studies that at exactly what that point is, or if this measure would get us to that point. But there's, I think, a concern that as marijuana taxes become, used to fund quite a few, different programs within state government, that eventually we will reach that tipping point. I think the other piece of discussion around putting it in the Blue Book, a 5% increase over, the next few years, is that a sizable enough jump that could, the people will notice, in their products, and whether that would get us towards a tipping point. I don't know if that really answers the question. I don't know of a specific number or studies that have suggested a specific number that would put us over that point, but I think there is discussion and some concern that we might be headed in a direction where that becomes a possibility.
Great, thank you so much. And on the third measure, Proposition 120, we had a question about sort of the distributional impacts of the measure. And so, for example, would this potentially disproportionately impact lower income individuals and or different markets, such that because it's focused on in particular lodging and multifamily real estate, can you think of any kind of economic ripple effects that might occur as a result of the measure?
I think in terms of sort of distributional impacts around the state, I think it will vary geographically more than any other, subset, whether you looked at, different income levels or that type of thing. I think the impacts in different regions of the state will probably be noticeable, just given that you have a lot of areas of the state that have very little multifamily housing properties, and you have other areas where maybe rely on that more. And then, lodging, I mean, I'm sure we can all think of some of the regions of the state that are, tourist destinations have a lot of lodging properties. So I think you could see maybe some impacts more geographically, than anything else. I think that we had some discussion about, impacting condos or, that type of thing. And because it's not expected to impact condos, I think that changes sort of who's most likely to be impacted. I think there's different opinions out there about whether the change in the assessment rate will change behavior or will change investment decisions, or change how these businesses choose to spend and where to invest. But I guess I don't look at it quite as much as something that will have significant income, disparities. But that's
Great, thanks so much. And again, on Proposition 120, this seems like a bit of a unique situation in that, a bill was passed. First, the measure was looking like it was going to be on the ballot, and then the General Assembly passes a bill that affects, its impact. Could you speak a little bit about how unique that is, and any other context there?
Yeah, it's very unique. I think, in our trying to understand it, get our heads around it. As far as we know, this hasn't really happened before. I think there have been situations where maybe the General Assembly adjusted some dates and appropriations to impact how a previous tax measure was accounted for. But as far as we know, this is a pretty unique situation. And it's something that we weighed a lot while writing this, of how to explain the situation to voters, how to both, reduce confusion for voters, explain the situation. And I think we looked at it as our job in the Blue Book is to provide voters with an easily understandable understanding of what the ultimate impact of the measure they're voting on is, and to find that right level of detail in the Blue Book was something that we discussed a lot. We went back and forth. We heard got quite a bit of feedback from folks, and went back and forth with the proponents, quite a bit. I think, the Blue Book is written to current law. It's written with, we assume all of the legislation that the General Assembly passes is constitutional until a court says it's not. So I feel really comfortable with the way that the Blue Book explains the situation to voters. I do think it's going to be really confusing. I think people will have different understandings of this based on whether they read the Blue Book, or what they hear in the media, or they just read the question on their ballot. So it's a confusing situation. And I think I'll be curious to see how it plays out, just in terms of voter understanding and voters, how voters approach it, I guess.
Sure. Great, thank you. Here's a question for both Matt and Anna, kind of zooming out a little bit and looking at the arguments for and against. Can you speak, maybe even broadly, to who the proponents and opponents are, or who might be in support or opposed to these measures?
So I can I guess, jump in on 119 and 120. On 120, the proponents of the measure is a group called Colorado Rising Action, I believe, and they've worked on, I would say, sort of similar type ballot measures, reducing tax rates in different ways. I don't know of an organized opposition to the measure. I think there is possibly one sort of percolating, but I haven't, talked to or heard from a really organized opposition group. I know there is a lot of concern from the Special Districts Association. I would put them probably in the opponent category. Concerned about funding for special districts, particularly fire protection districts around the state. So I think that the opposition to the measure mostly comes from the local government service side of things, and the proponents more from the perspective of providing property tax relief. In terms of 119, this one doesn't seem to split along party lines, as far as I understand. I think there's bipartisan support for the measure. I think there's also some bipartisan concern about the measure. And I think a lot of that, the opposition relates to the first argument against, which is, some public money that could be used for private tutoring services or that type of thing. So that's a measure that is, I think, it's not a party line situation. I think there's a lot of support for the measure on both sides of the aisle, and I think there are also concern and opposition from folks on all sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I'll add with regard to Amendment 78 and the legislative authority for spending state money. This one also doesn't have, clear partisan affiliation, I think, one way or another. I think I want to say two things to this. One, I think the challenge of evaluating Amendment 78 is that there's a lot that's unknown about how the measure will be implemented. So the way the measure is written, I think has a lot to do with, what voters will be considering is how it aligns with their values. As we tried to capture in our argument in support of and in our argument against the amendment, the amendment increases transparency and accountability, and those are things that I think a lot of people agree with. And of course, there's a cost to that, which is in some cases the literal cost of additional accounting, and in other cases some potentially unintended consequences as it relates to how these custodial funds are spent. So the downstream of this is that the legislature, if this passes, will have a lot of work to do to figure out exactly how it will be implemented. I don't think there's anyone's trying to really slow down or disrupt state government, but that the onus will be on the legislature to figure out what's the best way to implement it that pushes back against any of those kinds of consequences. So there's the way I think about this measure is that it involves a lot of trade-offs, and that's going to be a question for each voter to consider.
Great, thank you for that. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more specifically, Matt, to some of the potential unintended consequences of the measure. So, for example, taking higher ed, for example, and that a lot of custodial funds go towards higher education institutions. Could you kind of put some concrete legs on that, and maybe I understand that it's kind of, again, to your point, it all depends on how it's implemented. But if you could provide more context, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. We'll be perhaps lacking some concrete for exactly that reason. I can give you an example. There are, in current practice, there will be cases where, let's say, a public university applies for some grant funding, and currently they would receive that grant funding and would have the liberty to spend it, within the constraints of the grant itself. And that includes, if this is, for example, a multi-year program, they may generate interest on that, which would also be available for the university to use. So under Amendment 78, that grant money could qualify as custodial money and be transferred instead to this custodial funds transparency fund. And the legislature would then have to appropriate that money back to the university. Now, if there were a process in place that could happen very quickly, that's a case in which there could be very little, if any, impact on the university. However, if that were not the case, and this is again what we don't know about how it would be implemented, if that money were to sit in the custodial funds transparency fund for a significant amount of time, and if the amount of money were large, that could generate a significant amount of interest that would instead be transferred to the state's general fund and essentially be a source of revenue for the legislature to spend on anything. Now, the legislature, of course, could take that interest money, those interest earnings, and direct them back to the university where they would have been anyway. But the measure, of course, doesn't require that. It really leaves it up to the discretion of the legislature. So that's an example of a place where a university might miss out on some revenue if that would instead end up somewhere else in the state. There's another potential unintended consequence would be in the case of, you could imagine grant funding. If a state agency receives a grant, then that funding would normally just be spent, but now would require legislative appropriation before the state agency would be allowed to spend the money. Generally speaking, I think it's reasonable to suggest that if the state received some money, it would want to spend that money, but hypothetically, the legislature could choose not to appropriate that money and would essentially be able to limit state agencies' ability to receive and spend grants. So again, I don't have any reason to believe that is a likely outcome, but it is a possible outcome given the political nature of the state legislature. So. And again, I know I've said this a million times, and I'm sorry to say it again, but of course, all this would depend on how what the legislature decides to do in terms of setting up these processes for approving spending.
Great, thank you. So maybe time for one or two more questions, maybe just one. Anna, could you speak a little bit about the impact of Proposition 120 on, or I'm sorry, yes, it is 120 on the senior homestead and disabled veteran property tax exemption?
Yeah, so the measure allows $25 million to be exempt from the state revenue limit if that amount is spent on reimbursements to local governments for the homestead exemption. And that's really all it says. It does not change the availability of it. So if somebody receives the exemption now, that wouldn't change. It also doesn't change that the legislature would reimburse local governments for revenue loss because of the exemption. So those mechanics don't really change. Where we think it may have more of an impact is just sort of the state budgeting mechanisms. So when the state is in a TABOR refund situation, the homestead reimbursements to local governments are the first reimbursement or refund mechanism, I should say. And so exempting 25 million from the calculation of the spending limit and spending it that way rather than through the refund mechanism is more likely to just shift how TABOR refunds are distributed and how that's administered. I think when this measure was initially written, we weren't necessarily anticipating that there would be a TABOR refund situation, but we do now expect that the state will be in that situation for the next few years. So I think the most likely impact of this provision of the measure is shifting taxpayer refunds sort of between the available mechanisms. I will also note that this provision of the measure only goes through, I think it's fiscal year 26, 27. So it's a 5-year, for 5 years, the state, can keep this 25 million for this purpose. So it's not a long-term change to state budget or to the refund mechanisms. It's something for these first 5 years. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. I think it's, if you're dive into the details of the refund mechanisms, or the current state budget situation as it relates to the spending limits, then it's a applicable piece. But if it's, if you're a voter who's either interested in the exemptions or currently participates, or if you're a local government, it doesn't substantially change anything for those groups.
Great. Well, Anna and Matt, thank you so much. Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap up.
You bet. And I'll wrap up quickly. I started with a lot of respect for the task for you guys and the task that you were taking with the Blue Book. I have even more having heard about how you go about doing this. It's great. I wish every voter could participate in something like this, because you provided great insight into how you do this and what these measures are. So thank you so much. The association will be mailing you guys some gifts. I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but I so appreciate you guys taking the time. With that, I would ask everybody to thank Matt, Anna, and Kate for taking their time and presenting, maybe a silent applause. And we will let everybody get on to the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.